Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Designing for a Neurodiverse World. We're so thrilled to have you. My name is Christina Couch. I'm the administrator of the MIT Communications Forum, which puts on events like this throughout both fall and spring semesters. We're very, very excited to have this event today, and in particular, we want to kick it right off by thanking our sponsors. Specifically, Radius at MIT has been a great partner for many of our events, as well as the Mind Hand Heart Innovation Fund. They are really the two entities that make events like this possible. So thank you so much to them. So we're very excited about our panelists today. I'm just going to go down and introduce everybody, and then we'll kick off the event. Our moderator for this evening, first of all, is Dr. Rosalind Picard. Dr. Picard is the founder and director of the Affective Computing Research Group at MIT. She's also co-director of the Media Lab's Advancing Wellbeing Initiative and faculty chair of MIT's Mind Hand Heart Initiative. She co-founded the technology companies Empatica Incorporated, which creates wearable sensors and analytics to improve health, and Affectiva Incorporated, which delivers technologies to measure and communicate emotion. Coming up next is Dr. Ned Sahin.
Ned Sahin.
Ned Sahin, who I am butchering his name, unfortunately. Dr. Sahin is a neuroscientist and CEO of BrainPower LLC, a company that makes wearable artificial intelligence systems to aid people with brain-related challenges. He is a founding member of the Empowered Brain Institute and principal investigator for 7 government contracts for wearable brain monitoring systems to assess and improve cognitive states. His academic work has been published in prestigious journals such as Science and Nature Neuroscience. And at BrainPower, he focuses on building augmented reality systems that teach skills for social interaction, language, behavior, and job skills. Next on the list is Rafiq Abdus-Sabur. I'm pronouncing that. He was president and CEO of the Empowered Brain Institute, which is a nonprofit disability advocacy and support organization for individuals with autism and their families. Rafiq is also a board member for BrainPower LLC and founder of the education technology firm Edgewise Education. Coming up next, we have Finn Gardiner, is a disability advocate and policy analyst specializing in intersectional disability justice and accessible technology. He's a research assistant at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University, where his work focuses on public policies for autistic individuals. Mr. Gardiner also works with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and speaks frequently about his own experiences with autism. Dr. Karthik Dinakar is coming up next. He's a computer scientist in the fields of machine learning, natural language processing, and human-computer interaction. He's also a founder of C3PO, or the Cambridge Computational Clinical Psychology Org, a group of interdisciplinary researchers focused on bringing together machine learning, casual interface, and clinical psychology. Dr. Dinakar received an Asperger's diagnosis when he was a graduate student at MIT. For this event, we also want to mention that we have live captioning available. So there is the website if anybody would like those services. Once again, we'd like to thank Mind Hand Heart and Radius at MIT. If you have any interest in events like this, please come after the event and sign up for our mailing list. Now there's a pen you can do that with. Thank you so much to our panelists once again. Everybody's going to say a little bit about themselves, and then we'll kick off the moderated session. And thank you all for being here.
Great. So we're going to start with each of us saying a little bit about what we're currently thinking about and working on. And actually, I'm going to start on the end with Karthik. Yeah.
I'm a research scientist at the Media Lab, focusing on statistical machine learning, natural language processing, and human-computer interaction. I actually graduated from Rose's group just last year, so I'm kind of new in what I do in my current avatar. I've been focusing recently on the use of machine learning in the criminal justice system, where people all across the US, many states are adopting these risk assessment algorithms to inform judges and various decisions that people take as folks move through the criminal justice system. I'm deeply very troubled by this, and I don't think we should be substituting, placing our humanity in front of us when we deal with other human beings with something that just spits out a risk score, especially doing things like predicting how risky somebody might be in the future, as if they are metallic objects with a defined mass which can never change. And I'm super excited to collaborate with a bunch of people at the Media Lab. So that's what I do.
All right. I'm actually wearing several hats at the moment. I am currently working on several public policy briefs and projects. Recently, I wrapped up a project about making behavioral interventions that are actually empathic and actually have an effect on people with disabilities. For example, autistic people or people with ADHD who may be experiencing meltdowns or shutdowns. I also worked on a policy brief about telehealth and how these technologies can be used for people with all kinds of disabilities and some of the intersections between accessibility and state law and policy and other factors like affordability and other related issues. I'm also working on, in my spare time, I'm also working, I also do a lot of research around inclusive technology and making it more accessible, making it more inclusive for people with disabilities or people in different countries. I believe very strongly in the idea that technology is something that should be available to everyone. I don't think that it is a good idea to sort of have this idea in your head of the average technology user who is generally a white, cisgender American man without a disability. You can't have this ideal user in mind. You have to understand that there are all kinds of users that will be interacting with your product. And my research interests whether formal or informal, are informed by my own experiences as an autistic person. I was diagnosed when I was very young, about 3, and so I've always known about it. And I've always had this awareness of being different, of being excluded, of being sort of pushed to the margins for various reasons. Also I'm Black, and so I've experienced racism and ableism and several other kinds of marginalization. So I'm acutely aware of how technology, how policy can either include or exclude people. And so my work in toto is sort of devoted to dismantling this idea that policy or technology has to conform to this idea of this sort of platonic ideal of the ideal citizen or ideal user. I know they seem sort of like disparate disciplines, but for me, they're very integrated. So that's me.
Good evening, everyone. You can respond, it's okay. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So, my background is in education, and I bring that lens to the work of the Institute. When I think about designing for a neurodiverse world, two ideas obviously stick out, and that's the design element and then neurodiverse. And I think when I think about design, I think about experience. I think about what is the experience of at the individual level and at the collective level, and how do those experiences interact? And I feel like for our work at the Institute, so the Institute came out of Brainpower to complement the work that Brainpower is doing. And so to the extent that Brainpower, which Ned will speak more about in a moment, focuses on empowering the individual to have full access to technology and to the world and essentially realize their full potential. We focus more on the community or a collective experience and what we need to do, what we need to learn, and how we need to set up structures in society so that we're doing our part, right? And so that's the work that we focus on. We work with Avery Normandin at the Media Lab. I think he's in the Sculpting Evolution group to craft these environments that are truly neuro-inclusive. There's a common notion in education called Universal Design for Learning, and it came from universal design, which is a concept in architecture. And the basic premise of it is, if you're designing a doorway for a structure, for a building, you want to think about all the ways people who will access that doorway, right? So like people obviously will walk through it, but what about people who are disabled, who don't have legs, in a wheelchair, maybe they want to ride a skateboard through it, and sort of embedding that in the design right from the beginning, as opposed to adding a ramp later, right? And you see a lot of examples of that in architecture. So it comes from that concept, but it mainly it was established to address physical handicaps, and it doesn't do as good of a job, in my opinion, of addressing neuroatypical learning, right? So what we've tried to do is take those ideas, take ideas from the clinical world, take ideas from the environmental world. There's this movement around having a sensory-friendly experience, right? The more we learn about the language of autism and other neuroatypical profiles, you see places in society that are taking steps to accommodate this alternative experience. And so we sort of take the learning from all those places and try to create an experience that where everyone has a certain level of access to it, but you don't have to, when you enter it, you don't have to be identified as, oh, you have this issue, and so this is for you, and this is how you're going to engage, but it's embedded in your entire experience. And that's been our challenge, and that's what we've been working on. And I'm constantly reminded of how important it is to get it right. One of the things we also host are workshops for children who are neuroatypical, and we will get requests from families who, for one family in particular that sticks out of my mind, there was a woman who was bringing her daughter who was on the spectrum, and she said, we're really excited about this opportunity. We rarely see workshops like this, initiatives like this that really want to include us and are catered to our unique needs. But my daughter doesn't agree with her diagnosis, and if there's anything about this experience that labels her or directs attention to her difference, she'll be horrified, right? And so that's our challenge, right? So and I think if you can get it right, if you can create a truly neuro-inclusive environment, there won't be any need to label one child as this way. It's sort of embedded in the experience. Everybody gets this individualized, personal experience where you meet them where they are, and you sort of engage that zone of proximal development, which is a term from education, which accelerates their capacity to learn. And I think that's what we think about. That's what we're trying to perfect. We hope that we'll be able to distill what we learn from these experiments in language that is useful for engineers and policymakers and anyone who's interested in creating truly neuro-inclusive environments.
My passion and my company's mission is to empower people with invisible brain differences and brain challenges. And we do that at BrainPower, the name of the company, at many levels and meta levels. So for instance, we hire a lot of people on the autism spectrum and people with other diagnoses and maybe undiagnosed differences. We make a product that targets the autism community and another product that targets the people with brain injuries and some adjacent conditions. And we run internships for people who have a passion to helping the community, have a sibling in the community, and therefore are a member of the community, or are on one spectrum or another. And we model and live with all day, every day, these real challenges. This is not something that's in a spherical chamber, in a vacuum, in a lab. This is regular daily life for us as a team and for the people we're serving. So backing up, my background, my PhD, well, my master's was from MIT. And then my father was an MIT man through and through, and so I had to ask his permission to go get my PhD at Harvard. Safety school. And then postdoc out in California, which was not Boston. That was the main requirement for my postdoc. So I went to the Salk Institute. But all of that academic work and papers in good journals, I still had this need to, what I say now is to make tools for Tuesday. What are we going to do to meet the actual needs in a messy reality of family life and school life? And so we make practical tools and wanted to make them high-tech and nerdy and based on the newest in neuroscience. And just a quick thing so you know some of the challenges involved. So with the wearable computer, wearing our software can, first of all, find where faces are and get called to their attention because they turn into cool cartoons. And when I look at the cartoons, I start figuring out what the facial emotions are, thanks to Ros Picard's software. And if I decipher it correctly, I get points. It's gamified, compete. And by the way, if I'm starting to get stressed, we have a stress measuring algorithm, and start rocking, it'll pick that up and give me my favorite music, which can auto-adapt and so forth. So it's a multi-wearable environment, multi-purpose, and but not to be stapled to the person's head. This is something that you can do as a practice, 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day, and then you might think, well, can people with autism wear a thing on their head? Well, 200 say they can, because we've been testing this, and our 7 published papers say they can. Would they work in school? Yeah, published papers. Would they break it? It's not easy to break, and so forth. So we've been testing out the hypotheses, which comes down to a key thing. We've immersed ourselves in the community. When I say the community, what's the community? Because who are the stakeholders? Is it people with autism? Well, that's just part. Parents have one set of needs. Teachers have another set of needs. Their bosses, the principal of the school, has a very different set of needs. Government agencies have different sets of pressures. I'll go on more later. I don't want to keep going too far here. But main point is that all day, every day, immersed in life with differently abled minds. And it's fascinating, exciting, challenging for everyone, and a really rich environment, out of which it's quite probable products will come that were surprising based on what we first would have thought of, and likely to be compatible with more sets of minds and brains because we live it every day.
I'm inspired. I'll say just a little bit about what I do, and then most of the time I'm going to get you guys talking, and then we're going to bring the whole audience in a little while too. I love working with different kinds of minds. I'm currently teaching a course I started at MIT years ago on autism theory and technology, but we wonder if the word autism should not even be in the title, if it should just be about helping different kinds of minds to succeed. But every really cool thing my students and my research has become focused on recently really has sprung out of working with people on the autism spectrum. We started with trying to understand emotion, to build computers that were more emotionally intelligent, and started adapting that to help people understand emotion better. While trying to measure stress better, we accidentally discovered that we were picking up seizures, lo and behold. So I learned about epilepsy and a whole bunch of other neurological differences in our brains, and through that started commercializing wearables that could go out to not only monitor stress, but also help detect seizures. In fact, our first one from the Media Lab, I have to brag for a moment, just became FDA certified in the past few weeks. So crazy things that your students build that accidentally discover stuff can actually wind up becoming medically useful. Now we're back to emotion. You mentioned some of the software our team has built, commercialized through Affectiva. But at the Media Lab, we're really focused on understanding how emotion and its measurement, its communication, can enrich lives, all lives, and help us all flourish better. And I was thinking, Finn, as I was listening to you, there's so much talk about identity. I'm really fascinated by this these days. Identifying, I'm identifying up here with being quite different because I'm not wearing the dark blue jacket and the dark shirt, but also because I'm female, right? But I've never felt like I fit in to whatever the female role was as somebody who was attracted to engineering. Because when I went to school, they said I needed to make sure I took typing because I could become a secretary if I ever chose to work, or a teacher. They never really indicated I could be an inventor of cool technology. So I never really fit with what the expectations were with identities. So I've always kind of resisted those. But with emotions, as we get into the diversity of uses, I'm a completely different person when I'm using this and I'm stressed out, or when I'm tired, or when I'm really focused. And I'm not sure I'm a completely different person when I'm white or black using it. So while that is important for some things, when it comes to designing technology, I think we need to think not just about all of these identity things, but also all the different things a single person can be when they're using it as well. So I'll bring that perspective in too. So today's isn't just about all those labels, although those are important, but also all the ways we can be diverse within one person.
I fully agree. Though I talked about separate identities, I do have a very strong individual identity. I identify with my own accomplishments, I identify with my own ideas, I identify with my own opinions, my politics, my philosophy, my creativity, my intelligence, these other internal factors that are, while they're not completely separate from these externalized identities that I have, they are vastly important. With regard to how people, how this relates to technology, or how this relates to how people move through the world, when I was growing up, I was often underestimated because I was diagnosed very early. I had a doctor tell my parents that I would apparently never learn. So that was clearly not true. Everyone can learn. And there is this idea that if you are on the spectrum, you can't have emotions, you can't interact with the world, you can't learn, you can't pick things up. And I mean, of course, that's patently untrue. And I also think that technology can be used to sort of facilitate interacting with the world and adapting one's experiences. I also think that technology shouldn't be used to fix people, but help them navigate through the world that isn't necessarily created for them. For example, in my case, I found that for one of the things that I struggled with was being able to reach out and make friendships that worked for me, that matched my interests, that matched my matched my personality, that sort of matched the way that I perceived the world and the people in it. And honestly, one of the things that helped me was actually going online. And I actually found that interacting with people through text was an easier way of picking up on social cues. And I think that may also apply in the educational sphere or other places where autistic people or other people who tend to interact more easily with text can have social interactions and other difficulties interpreted through text, through explanatory things, sort of like tooltips that pop up. For example, you could do social training that uses textual explanations. Or, for example, like glasses, you could have something pop up that says happy or sad or depressed or angry. Sort of this concurrent, sort of concurrent processing that allows you to understand and interpret the world as you move through it. And I also think that one of the things that I personally find really exciting and sort of revelatory is the expanded use of assistive technology for communication, like assistive and augmentative communication, like Proloquo to Go on the iPad and similar apps on Android, although I believe most of them are on iOS. Because before, a lot of non-speaking autistic people were constantly underestimated. They were treated as though they were unintelligent, that they couldn't communicate, that they couldn't interact with the world. I was personally a late talker, and I feel as though I I would not have been interpreted as intellectually disabled if I did not, if I had had the technology that's currently available now. Unfortunately, I was 2 years old in 1988, so that was a figment of people's imaginations back then. So I think that just sort of leveraging the things that technology can do can help raise expectations of people with disabilities. Because I think that underestimation is just toxic. I think that it is one of the most deleterious things that you can go through as a person with a disability.
Agreed. I'd love to hear each of you say a little bit more about either, and you can kind of pick your diverse question here, the neurodiversity thing you're most excited about in design, or what is not neurotypical? This is a question from the communication forum. What is not neurotypical? So pick one of those two. We'll allow a little freedom here, and I'll go with whoever Finn just spoke. So I don't know, Ned, Karthik?
Go for it. Okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay, we'll go Ned and then Karthik.
We joke a little bit around the company because we're unclear if anyone in the company is neurotypical. And of course, it raises the question. It's a little bit trite to say, hey, we're all on the spectrum, we're all not neurotypical. That's neat, and that's important as a perspective to understand that there are many spectra, and we fall wherever we do in a Gaussian or non-Gaussian distribution. It's also good to understand that, like in a Gaussian distribution, many people fall into a fairly narrow space where they're predictable. That is a real thing. Again, it makes you feel good to say, hey, we're all on this big spectrum. But in fact, ignoring that would be a problem because there's a lot of blindness that comes with this of, interesting term to use, sorry, but in terms of who your customers are and what the customers are saying to you. Because if you say, well, we put out a product, it was good enough for many people are saying this is fine. Many describes that central tendency of a distribution. So you may not get the feedback, and you may be unable to bring it back in if you don't understand that, in fact, many people do fall into a heteronormative, cisgender, blah, blah, blah. And if you just cater to them, you may not notice you're missing, say, 20%. And hey, 80% is good enough, fine. But that's 20%. That's 1 out of 5 that you're missing. So it's important to understand that there are people at edges of a distribution, but then they're all over those edges of distribution. So there isn't a stereotype to people who are not stereotypical. And so it's harder to reach them. It's harder to meet them. It's particularly harder to sit in a room of, say, 4 white-haired men and pontificate about what it's like to meet them and meet their needs. So it's not just for titular purposes or to look good on Facebook that you have a diverse team. It is absolutely necessary. On top of that, the world is now interconnected, and ratings come to you from all parts, and people who are most offended will be most vocal. So that 20%, even if it's 2%, will now give a different kind of feedback, and it'll hit you when it's probably too late. All the best to bake it in from the beginning. So I somewhat answered a different question than you asked, because I don't know what is non-neurotypical. It depends on the domain. It depends on time. People change over time. If some of the non-neurotypicality is a developmental difference, I will get there, but I will get there slower than the large central tendency of the cohort, then my neurodivergence will change over time. At some point, I might, from external purposes, catch up. Oh, and then everything's fine, right? But no, I don't have the same shared experience as others in that group. And so I won't connect with and identify with the product, the service, the philosophy, the messaging. There's more, but there's more panelists.
Go Karthik and then Rafiq.
I actually don't know what it means to be neurotypical. It's kind of like a machine learning problem where you ask what the objective function and whose setting that is, and that kind of is decided by a community of people, and everybody basically just follows what's the norm. I will say though that when I hear things about getting a label or getting a diagnosis, it seems to me, just by personal experience, that what matters the most is the first principle of what is it that we truly value. For instance, when I took the autism class, the first time Ross taught it in class, I was just reading all these things and just going, wait a minute, every single thing because I was always social, but with crazy sensory processing issues and a whole lot of like GI issues, and nobody could really explain what was going on. And it was kind of liberating for me to get the eventual diagnosis. I didn't see it as a label. And I think a large part of why that was so empowering for me is I was in a community of people where neurodiversity is actually celebrated. So I think that actually placing a value on that is probably more important than, it's not about getting a label or not a label, it's how it's being accepted or perceived. I've met many people at MIT who are very social, but in small doses sometimes. And they just have very similar sensory issues. And it's very difficult, I think, just to describe anybody as this is what we think is neurotypical and this is what is not neurotypical. I think just accepting everybody is probably, the more we focus on first principles, the better we can just be, because it doesn't matter.
Can I inject a short story on that before we come to you, Rafiq? I'm reminded of, I would have all my students over to my house regularly, and one year, one of my brightest students, who when we all put, person you'd most like to have lunch with, he put, "I don't like people," on the web. He came to my house. My kids were jumping all over him, and he says, "I want you to know, this is my one social event of the year." I said, "Well, I hope it's a good one." He looked like he was having fun. But at MIT, the more different you are, the more you fit in. It's sort of the opposite of Harvard, I hear. We'll try to maintain those good differences.
Crosstown rivalry.
Yeah. Rafiq? Yeah.
So I'd like to answer the question about what I'm excited about. I think it relates to what the previous panelists mentioned, and I think we're at an exciting point in the sort of the history and continued evolution and human society in terms of the way we deal with difference. I think we're at an important place. We have a long history. If you think about women's suffrage to the civil rights movement, where groups who were different were essentially the gay rights movement, groups who were different and just by virtue of their difference were persecuted, were oppressed, were ostracized from society and kept out of opportunities in a myriad of ways. And I think I'm excited about the time we are living in now, because I think for a long time in this society, it was a foregone conclusion that someone who had autism or someone who was neuroatypical, that they were less intelligent, that they didn't really have anything to contribute to society. I mean, up until the late 1940s, if you had any type of cognitive difference, you were placed in a state institution. They closed the doors, and you're forgotten about. Families, signed away their family members because we're like, well, they're different. We don't know. Like you take them, and there are videos, and some of you may know Geraldo Rivera. I mean, he's kind of infamous now, but he actually came to fame through exposing one of the largest school in the country that did this, and when he basically going in during an unscheduled visit and shining a light on all the horrendous practices that were happening there. And I think and when he would talk to some of the physicians and staff, they would say, we don't even know what these people are capable of. We've never tried, we've never asked, we've never tried, we've never tried to teach them anything. We don't know. And I won't speak about their deplorable conditions because it upsets me. But I think if you're interested, you should do a Google search for Willowbrook and Geraldo Rivera, and you'll see that video. But those days are long gone. We recognize that that people who are neuroatypical have a unique contribution, and I feel like we're not at the point yet where neurodiversity or the movement for neurodiversity is seen alongside the other movements I mentioned, but it is a civil rights issue, but I think we're close, and I think and that makes me hopeful and excited, and obviously it's important to me. I have a personal stake in it, but I'm also because of my own personal experience as a minority, it means that much more to me that I'm a part of this fight, and so yeah, that's what makes me excited.
Ben?
What does it mean to be not neurotypical? I think that's a very complicated question, as several other people have said on the panel. I think that there are a lot of different ways that people can be non-neurotypical. I do think that there are people, as Ned said earlier, that do kind of tend toward the central tendency, but there are a lot of people in the tails of the Gaussian distribution. For example, the most notorious thing that is Gaussian, has in a Gaussian distribution is intellectual ability. Like somebody with an intellectual disability is neurodivergent. But people on the right side of the tail are also neurodivergent. For example, if you are so intellectually advanced that the standard school curriculum doesn't fit you, then yes, you are neurodivergent. You may not fit in with your classmates. You may not, you're in school, you're bored. You hear them repeating things for 10 times, like review time, you're like, no. See, that's an example of neurodivergence. Of course, autism, and then even autism, the meaning of autism, it's multivalent. There's not just one autism, there's several flavors of autism. And for example, some people may fit a more Asperger type, some autistic people may have an intellectual disability, some people may not have an intellectual disability. Some people may struggle more with social skills, some people may struggle more with sensory stuff or executive functioning. In my case, I find executive functioning difficulties, that is planning, organizing, et cetera, more difficult than social problems these days. My sensory issues, while they've receded in the past, I still find them more disabling than my social issues. So yes, even autism, which is sort of seen as this monolithic thing, autism. For example, you see PSAs and does your child have autism? Or the May Institute ads that are on the T, does someone you love have autism? They tend to treat autism as this sort of monolithic thing, and it's not. The same goes with ADHD. You can be primarily inattentive. You can be primarily hyperactive. You can be a mix of the two. Or you can have Alzheimer's. You can have some brain injury, some sort of cognitive disability. There are so many different ways to be neurodivergent. Also mental, psychiatric disabilities, bipolar or schizophrenia, or borderline personality disorder. There are so many different ways that you can be non-neurotypical, and of course you're dealing with all different kinds of access needs because there is not one singular neurodivergent profile. A lot of people say, those weirdos over there, but that's not how it is. In order to understand how we can make technology more inclusive, we have to understand how multi-textured, how multi-layered the idea of neurodivergence is, even within a specific diagnosis. You can't just say, hey, you're autistic, you have these needs. You have ADHD, you have these needs. You have an intellectual disability, you have these needs. For example, something that, I do agree that there is such a thing as universal design, and I think that there are ways to accomplish universal design while taking into account all these differences. But you also have to sometimes it's important to have multiple settings to accommodate different kinds of needs. For example, my needs are different from somebody who has dementia or an intellectual disability. I don't necessarily need language simplified in the same way that somebody with an ID would. But there are sometimes ways that something designed for one population can work for others. For example, this is incredibly arcane, but I think that in this room it's probably not a problem. There was this font designed by a company called FSMe. It was designed for this British nonprofit that works with people with intellectual disabilities. And it was designed for adults with intellectual disabilities to be easier to read, but because of the shapes of the letters, because of the way things are formed, it disambiguates shapes like the capital I and the L and the lowercase a. It's also useful for people with dyslexia. And then I don't even have either of those disabilities, and I find it more readable. So that's an example of how universal design can take into account all these very different kinds of neurodivergence and make things accessible.
You just beautifully answered the next question I was going to ask too. Thank you. You're like the innovator for where we're going here. I wanted to ask all of you for examples like that. Where does designing for not the majority actually wind up being something that perhaps a lot more people than you designed for really appreciate? And the font is a beautiful example. Others?
Okay. Thank you. Well, so autism, luckily, is non-fatal. So you have children with autism, which is what a lot of people think of. But then there are adults with autism, as are joining us. But one of the issues is employment. And employment is probably the single most protective thing against mental health negative outcomes. Not any pill or any therapy, but having a job. And people with autism have about a 50% unemployment rate. People with autism and a college degree have an 80% unemployment rate. It gets worse. They're competing for different jobs. They're well trained for something, but there are certain things that keep that raw brain power locked in, such as it's hard to pass an interview because of the social issues sometimes. It's really significant if 80% of what amounts to 1 or 2% of your entire population ends up unemployed. So we took on this challenge very carefully and developed a jobs training program and a remote digital job coaching platform. And we received a federal grant for this. So we have a direct congressional grant for digital job training. And what we realized, we went around, okay, what's important for someone with autism to help get a job? Making eye contact with the interviewer. What else is important? Trying to determine, are you talking too much? Are you not talking enough? Okay, how to determine the appropriate language and level of language and whether to use a swear word or so forth in certain contexts. Okay, how to operate around that proverbial water cooler. All right. So which of these things is restricted only to autism and not applicable to anyone else? Yeah, right, nothing. Right, so we ended up generating essentially a interview training program. Useful for all, useful for many. And we just got back yesterday, we did a trip to a college that wants to adopt our program, not only in technology for people with a diagnosis, but for people generally, seeking for college and career readiness. So this idea then somewhat saying the opposite of what I said earlier, that if you take this seriously, that we are all on the spectrum, well, the flip side of that is tools well-tuned for people who sometimes have the tougher version of the regular human challenge of interacting with others. If you can get it there, if you can nail it in a really, really complex situation, it may be broadly applicable to all, and that was an example.
Yeah. And can I just
Yes.
add to that? I think, and the other side of that, obviously, is that when a business decides not to hire someone because they're not presenting neurotypical characteristics, it's a form of discrimination, right? And so what we do at the Institute is we host workshops for businesses, for entrepreneurs, and we say, look, this is the language of autism. These, if someone is not making eye contact with you and you think that that's justification, that speaks to their inability to be a good employee or to possess some skill set that you think is valuable, we're here to tell you that you're wrong. We're here to educate you so that you don't continue to discriminate against people who could potentially contribute and help your company grow and contribute to the creativity of design and decision making and in every aspect of the work that they're doing. And so we think about that same issue, and we come up with ways to train come up with tools for that the public, the general public, can use to empower them to sort of be the best version of themselves and to be which is an inclusive environment, inclusive, supportive, nurturing environment for everyone in the same way that it is for neurotypical people.
So I'll just give some personal examples of stuff I learned in the class, which I started to follow, but I started deploying it on quote-unquote neurotypical people. One of the things that I found very useful is heavy blankets. I don't know how many people here, I really sleep very soundly when I put a heavy blanket. The deep touch pressure really helped me. And I got myself a rocking chair because I felt like frequent back and forth really calmed me. And whenever some friends of mine who get really stressed, I just used to get up and kind of just get them to sit on the chair without actually telling them to sit in the chair. Of course, like when you sit on a rocking chair, you start rocking, and almost immediately you can see that they can start thinking a lot better. So, which kind of tells me some of the things that we've historically seen as a disability, or just they pace a lot, or they have some of these special needs, can actually be beneficial for a whole group of people, just with different extent. And I was talking recently to a gastroenterologist at MGH who was giving a talk here. And he said something like, for the vast majority of people who come into his practice with something like irritable bowel syndrome, which nobody likes to talk about, he said, in medicine, because, quote unquote, only the people that are not neurotypical exhibit these kinds of things. And he said the vast majority of them are women and people on the autism spectrum. And he said that his practice has evolved so much right now where they actually don't think that a lot of the problems people face is because of either increased acid production or inflammation in the gut. It's something to do with highly sensitive nerve endings that kind of mediate strong response from people. And he said that as soon as he realized that, he decided he cannot practice only gastroenterology. He needs to investigate gastroenterology, and it's helped a lot of his other patients who are not on the autism spectrum as well.
Bringing up a point we could have mentioned, we have diverse neuronal systems in our body too. Everybody keeps talking about the brain and brain power, but we have 100 million neurons in your gut that exhibit REM-like behavior when you sleep, and they learn and do all kinds of cool things too. So we have a second brain, as Michael Gershon has written about, and others, that also runs our bodies, as anybody who has teenage sons like me can agree to as well. Our stomachs, I know we're getting near dinner time too, dangerous topic. Any further comments on, yep.
I was just thinking of two different things. Number one, the thing that you mentioned about GI issues reminded me of two studies that I read. One was the Intense World interpretation of autism that I remember coming across a few years ago. And there's another one, like Hyper Bodies, Hyper Minds, where people who are, who tend to be on the far right side of the intellectual distribution tend to have stronger reactions to different environmental factors. And I think GI issues and allergies were one of the things I came across. So sometimes people who experience the world more intensely may also have physical responses that are also more intense, based on these studies that I was looking at fairly recently. Also, regarding sort of this universal design theme that we were discussing, I was also thinking about how closed captioning and subtitles are not only beneficial for people who are hard of hearing or deaf, they're also helpful for the general population at large. I remember hearing about this. There was a study, yes. I remember hearing about this at a conference that I was at. It was a conference that the Institute for Community Inclusion was putting on a couple of years ago, and one of the researchers there was talking about universal design, and he had mentioned that people, whether they're deaf or hard of hearing or not, were able to benefit from seeing subtitles on movies. Like, for example, I know people who aren't deaf or hard of hearing that benefit from subtitling, and also there are folks like autistic people and other people who may have auditory processing issues or attention span issues that benefit from having subtitles.
I've started turning them on all the time. I love them. Yeah,
Especially like if you
have
have, like if you're watching
problems
this
with hearing, but watch an old favorite movie and you'll pick up a lot of things you missed. All right, I want us to give the audience time to ask questions, and there are microphones on both aisles, so please feel free to grab a mic and anything goes here.
There's another dimension, which is the temporal one. Assuming you have that fictional neurotypical individual, they will navigate through time, and the mind will change. And so I'm dealing with an 86-year-old mother who's had a stroke, but watching her try to use technology, like little things like a carrot, it means she should touch the pointy part, but she thinks of it kind of like a bracket, so she touches the other side. And so there are a whole lot of things, or it's some designer who says, this looks cool. And all meaning has been stripped from the interface. You have to learn the arbitrary symbols. And to be blunt, somebody who's 86 is not likely to rapidly adapt to rapidly evolving user interfaces based on the whims of some designer. So there's a whole other dimension to this, which is just as we navigate through time, our minds will change. I mean, when I see your glasses, I just want the camera that tells me, who am I looking at?
Talking to.
Their name. And Lord knows what percentage of the population would be desperate. I hear chuckles around me.
Two hands, everybody.
We're all looking for, so all of us probably have something, but I think a real important aspect of this is change over time within the population. And that's a really important thing for us to think about, because at one point when I was here as an undergrad, I had my first HP 35 calculator, and that was the state of the art of digital technology. And I used to be the go-to guy. Now that I'm in my 60s, now it's like, wait, what is Snapchat and why are you doing it? It's watching these waves of change have a real impact in terms of how we interact with this stuff, because people keep arbitrarily changing interfaces for what seems to be nothing more than a commercial advantage. I'll screw you up and give you something else and force you to learn it. So,
I'd love to, if you can, maybe we can share
Jump in, yeah.
Thank you. Some changes over time reveal what was already always there. So that gets harder over time, so you've got to focus down on the core neural resources and apply on that. And they can teach us what we should have done all along, to make something intuitive and simple, which sounds very intuitive and very simple, which it's neither. There's a company that is not one that does lots of humanitarian stuff for the world, that pretty much makes 7 products with near slave labor and has $100 billion in the bank and does nothing with it of great use for the world. And that unnamed Apple company pretty much just makes things extremely intuitive. They put clothing on other people's computers. And I'm not biased at all. But what's amazing is they got that $100 billion or whatever because they made it intuitive. It's really, really hard. It takes time to achieve simplicity, but it's so desperately important. there's more to it than it's just hard because you have to make it pixel perfect. Because what does intuitive mean? It means that it will make sense for me. But we just agreed that there are 7 billion me's out there. And what's intuitive in Abu Dhabi or Abidjan or Akron, and what's intuitive for the 86-year-old, for the 6-year-old, how could we possibly make it intuitive for everyone? One lucky thing about this great time where we live is new technology is coming along that makes that possible. This is meta-level technology. We just had a wonderful conference call with a different large tech company today. I can't reveal, but they're about to bring out to market some amazing machine learning algorithms. These are the kinds that are iteratively machine learning, sort of machine learning to the next degree, and where they want our use case because they want a really hard problem where the software would not only learn about itself and get better at doing what it's going to do, but learn you and become better at being the companion to you, the cognitive prosthetic, the outsourced brain of the neural wiring that's been pared away since you were younger in that case. So it's an amazing thing where we need to fight always to achieve that simplicity and the intuitiveness for all minds, but also there's some technology that might give us a pass that can do its job to self-customize to people.
I would argue, like, one of the problems with the iPad reader interface, they took away the skeuomorphisms that she understood.
You completely anticipated what I was going to say. Well done.
But what she needs is the version that realizes she's not, okay, this slick interface might be good if she was 22, and figure out, well, let me try this interface. And realize, oh, her error rate just went way the hell down. My accelerometer isn't getting slammed against the table multiple times. And subtle hints to the machine that happy customers.
Right.
Draws a software on the camera to tell mom sad mom.
Frustrated mom. The first emotion that was not in the book that we detected was frustration. I was.
Thank you. My name is Meryl Alper. I'm a professor at Northeastern, so other side of the river. And I'm an ethnographer who studies how kids on the autism spectrum use media and technology. So I have two questions. The first one is, we're at MIT, kind of home of epicenter of technology, and wondering your thoughts on the role of the social sciences of social scientists in kind of developing new technology. And then the second follow-up question, because I think of what can social scientists bring, is your thoughts on, we're talking about technology and the autism spectrum, and where you think talk of the socioeconomic spectrum fits into that discussion as well.
Okay. As the social scientist on the panel, I'll address those issues. My undergraduate degree is in sociology, and then public policy is basically social science. So I do think that sociological issues do come into play. I think that technology should or does reflect the culture to which people belong. Culture and society are embedded in technology. People often treat technology as a sort of deracinated entity that is not connected to the culture of the designers and the culture of the users, but that's patently untrue. To give an example, it may sound a little trivial, but it's an example of how culture is reflected in technology. For example, things like spell checkers. Even within one language, one spell checker won't work for every language. English, a spell checker made for the United States will not work in any other country because we can't spell. But anyway, also things like facial recognition. To use a more serious example, you need to be aware that the machine needs to be able to pick up people of different skin colors and recognize that they're seeing people. There is actually this supposedly intelligent hand-washing, it's like hand dryer. I remember seeing it on Twitter a little while ago, and there was a white person that rubbed their hands under it, and it worked. But somebody, I think it was either black or Middle Eastern, South Asian, et cetera, came up, and they tried it. It didn't work. So you have to be aware of things like race or gender. You can't assume that your users are of a certain gender. You can't assume that people belong to a certain social class. You can't assume that people belong to this default. As I said earlier, you have to be aware that culture and identity and experiences are related to technology. They're not these separate entities. Because some people go like, here's social science and here's hard science. No, we're people, and because we're people, both these things intersect. And often quantitative research often bears out the things that qualitative research does anyway. And there's also, mixed methods research, which I really like. Now, regarding the issue of socioeconomic status, I find, of course, a lot of this technology that's used is expensive. Like getting iPads that talk is expensive. Getting glasses that help you interpret the world is expensive. And I do think that it is absolutely imperative that policymakers are able to fund these services for people of all ages, not just children, can use these technologies in order to navigate the world more easily in a way that helps them to adapt. I think that, of course, charitable organizations could also do it, but I think that the government is, like the US government has far more money than any number of nonprofits, as much as a nonprofit might want to donate. Also, the government is more efficient. They have more resources to distribute these things. They, for example, these services could be theoretically covered as telehealth. There are a lot of states that have clear, that have guidelines for telehealth, and while some of them need to be reformed to cover services beyond remote visits or keeping data or the other technologies that are currently being included in a lot of states' telehealth statutes, I think that these tools, these adaptive tools, could be included as materials that can be covered by Medicaid, that could be covered by private insurance, that could be covered by vocational rehabilitation or other state organizations, like state-run organizations that interface directly with people with disabilities, their families, and the people who support them.
Can I?
Yes, Karthik.
I think I feel very strongly about this, and I love MIT. This is a very homely community for me. But I think we have to be honest when we say that sometimes there is a rush to actually propose a technical solution for things without really understanding the ramifications of how they can be used. Very concrete example, for instance, all the bunch of risk assessment algorithms that are coming out now, which is really like trying to evaluate a very vulnerable, socioeconomically disadvantaged and historically marginalized and even criminalized audience, a group. It seems to me like several of the so-called like technical solutions people are using. Let's use machine learning algorithms to see who's high risk, medium risk, or low risk. If it's low risk, let's just let them out. Let's stop being the most incarcerated country in the industrialized world. And a lot of times, people don't really realize the way in which it can exacerbate bias in the data, how actually something that was actually designed with very good intentions by the folks who created it can have really harmful effects on the marginalized communities. And I think the answer or a way or approach to think about that is it's sometimes very easy to basically just be from the machine learning community and say, well, the psych people are mostly doing soft stuff, and I'm doing probabilistic graphical models or whatever. And for me, I think it was very kind of a paradigm change where I stopped seeing social science research as any less rigorous than what I thought I was doing. And we need better ways to kind of weave in qualitative methods and actually understand the populations we are working with before actually rushing into design stuff.
Interdisciplinary discussion is absolutely required in order to make this work. I agree.
Agreed. Ned?
Quickly on socioeconomics. Gentleman who just left there because he had another commitment was, he's one of our clinical staff. We have a clinical staff, because we run clinical trials. He's an MD, psychiatrist, but he also had a grant for studying autism in disadvantaged communities. And so he's done some interesting studies and published on that, and it's informed our work. Just very interesting, you see that there's certain communities, with the Black community or even some further on the fringe, where it's like, wow, great, they have much less autism. Yeah, no. Not diagnosed, harder to get the appointment, less of a point because the services aren't there, and so on and so forth. Really some nuanced, interesting stuff. But we've rolled that into what we do. Had the privilege of a 4-hour dinner with Temple Grandin, and got a lot of wonderful insight. So interesting that she can be in and talk about so perfectly. She's her own Rosetta Stone. But she gave some feedback that, like, this is great, but she prefers things made of cardboard because it's expensive. And so when we recently crowdfunded to get the device out into the community, we took this into account and created different methods for payment plans and to try to get hardware through home computer-based services, waivers, and health savings accounts and so forth. Found ways to find other pockets of money to pay for the hard part, literally the hardware, and to give the software very, very, very inexpensively. You have to think about what goes into the life cycle and the other pressures that are going on in people's lives, and we've tried to model that and address it. Someday, of course, technology costs come down. That being said, I feel a little bit of pang of guilt because we have to sell a piece of hardware that's expensive along with it. But in the end, we're mostly software, and software has the magical ability that someone in Myanmar or in Maryland, or someone whose mother is ill, and instantly download something. And if it's correctly delivered and there is the platform, you can benefit 1 billion people tomorrow. The software revision cycle can be so fast and can affect so many people. So there is that capability to leapfrog for people who are actually in the most disadvantaged situations to suddenly leapfrog the many next steps potentially of development because of that. Mm-hmm. I'm optimistic.
I also just wanted to answer or respond to that quickly. Coming from the world of education tech, I feel like there are a lot of great technological tools that are that are born into existence by engineers, and like, look what I've created, this is a great thing. And now what are we going to use it for? Well, we can use it for this, and maybe teachers could use it to do some aspect of their job that before was analog or manual. They think about all the applications for this piece of technology or this invention, and if you know anything about education tech, there's this like huge wasteland of companies and products that have tried to permeate or infiltrate the market and fail for one reason or another. If you ask me, someone who comes from education, I think it's the social science piece that they miss. And I think that a lot of tech companies are run by engineers and tech people, mathematicians, quantitative people, when schools, the industries that they want to be profitable in or succeed in they're not mathematical. They're more like multicellular organisms, and it's messy and it's qualitative, and there's background and there's context, and if you want to boil it down to these neat points, okay, this is our customer, this is the pain point, this is what we're going to address, right? And just roll it out to everyone. Chances are you're gonna fail because you don't get the nuance, and I feel like that's where social science really comes into play and is really important when you understanding the customer, understanding the individual. Tip O'Neill, a famous Massachusetts politician, had a saying. It was all politics are local, and I think it's true of every aspect of our experience. It's all personal, right? And so you have to understand everything that goes into why the individual, who the individual is, how they came to be that way, what motivates them, and that's the environment in which they grow up, the family that raised them, the experience, the educational experience, all these things. The social science side there's socioeconomics. And so I think it's important. It should play a much larger role in the conversations around how tech can be of use and of service to populations that benefit from it, whether it's education or in other industries. I think that conversation doesn't happen as often as it should.
While the next question's getting up there, I'll just remind of a quote from the late Marvin Minsky, who would say, "You don't really understand a problem until you've understood it many different ways." And I've always appreciated that as I try to bring in diverse viewpoints on our work. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maeve O'Byrne. I'm actually an undergraduate student from UMass Boston. And my question actually comes from something Finn mentioned earlier. You told us a story about how when you were young, you had a physician tell you that you would never learn or something crazy like that, which breaks my heart because I'm an aspiring physician myself. And I feel like physicians should be an ally to those that are neurodiverse. So what advice would you give to patient care providers to be more neuro-inclusive, as you would say?
I would say that, firstly, everyone can learn, whether they have an intellectual disability or not. Everybody has an innate intelligence. Everybody has the ability to understand the world to at least some extent. Also, I would say that while you should understand that people have a disability and may have limitations, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't grow. Sort of that whole growth mindset mentality as opposed to the fixed mindset. And understanding that your job is to support. You're not supposed to bring down these pronouncements because, as I said, this doctor thought that I would never learn, that I had an intellectual disability. And then a couple years later, they saw me doing other things, and then then I was labeled gifted a couple years later. So, it's like they thought I was here, and then I turned out to be here. So you can't just go, this is how you're gonna be forever. You can't think that way. And it's just, you cannot just bring down these absolute pronouncements. You have to grow with the person. You can't just sort of assign them into a role and expect them to fit into that role for the rest of their lives. It's just it's not productive. It's demeaning, it's dehumanizing, it's demoralizing, it's destructive. And also it's just dead wrong. So that's what I'd say.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great advice.
Hi, I'm Bill Fleming. I'm a business and marketing guy, and I work with the local design community. And my best friend has a 5-year-old who's nonverbal autistic, and she introduced me to the concept of neurodiversity. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here, but I'm happy to, and this is an amazing topic. One of the things that I'm aware of, given that part of this is a design symposium, is that a big part of success with design is prototyping, user research, iteration, and because we were talking about, one of your expressions was people on the margins, makes it difficult for user research. Just looking to get some feedback on your take on that whole aspect of it.
Clarify the question. So it was, how do you find the people who are going to give you the feedback if they're the ones that are harder to find, or no?
It might be a two-part question. One is, how do you find that? Because the diversity within those margins is wide. It could be the 60-year-old or the 86-year-old, and it could be all different factors with that. And then once you do get people, how do you actually go about testing, given some of feedback mechanisms that traditional designers would get are challenged because of different communication issues?
For sure. I'll take it quickly. There are actually federal guidelines on what usability looks like and how to test to some degree. Not perfect, but there are some starts, and there are some great companies and others who've attempted, so you can follow their lead. But for sure, I think what you're hinting at there is it's hard to hear what literally people don't say if they're non-speaking autistics. And to hear the feedback, you also need to be able to incorporate. So I want to design a syllabus, I want to design a product, I want to design a communication, a blog post, and reach a lot of people. How do I go through that iterative process and incorporate the feedback? If it's going to come to a mind that wasn't expecting that answer, how do I really know what that answer meant? And again, diverse team, respecting members of the team's opinions as equal to one's own. Iterate and test. You set, it's science, right? You set a hypothesis, you set a threshold, and go out there and test it. And then respect the rubric. Don't say, okay, well, I think if 80% of people who come in with a diagnosis according to the ADOS can use it, then it's the thing, let's do it. And then they come in and it's only 70%, and you're like, yeah, but I think I'll be fine. No, have a rubric, respect it. Otherwise, you're iterating the rubric, which you also can do. But take it very, very seriously. People, I find, who are in a community, a marginalized community, a different community, are extremely, if approached correctly, extremely eager to help out. They want to help others. Parents of people with different abilities are very eager to help other parents. You know, someone who's 5 years into the diagnosis sees someone who's 1 year into the diagnosis of their children, and says, I know what you're going through here. You think there's a quick fix. There isn't. And the depression comes next year. But I can get you through that because I know what the light is like on the other end of the tunnel. And people really want to help if you listen to their voices.
I want to add something to that too. Those of you who do machine learning know you have a training set and it's almost never big enough, so you jitter the content a little bit to try to get more out of it. And similarly, when you don't have quite as many users coming in, or what tends to happen, I've seen like Microsoft years ago, it was very cool to get paid $50 an hour and go in their modern facility and see the new coolest thing. And one of the new coolest things that got 2 thumbs up from everybody was this little animated paperclip. and looked really happy to see you and looked really happy to give you advice. And if you're in a really great mood, I'm testing some cool new stuff, and you're really happy, that's a great experience. So no surprise it got 2 thumbs up under that circumstance, right? What happened later was it would pop up when people were frustrated and things aren't working, and you know, you've got this major deadline and this little thing is walking into your office and smiling and looking happy, and you're ready to shoot it, right? Because they didn't jiggle the data, right? They sort of treated everybody in that state that they came in. So I think, again, we can get even greater diversity out of our test users by having them take it home or test it in different circumstances, or you got to be careful how you do this because you don't really want to upset people, but maybe put them in a situation that's a bit more stressful, not just this happy, treat them well. I mean, you do want to treat people well, so it's delicate. But I think together we come up with ways that simulate more of the real life situation. Real life use is the very best for testing. Let them take it home. And then they get past their friendly, oh, I like it, everything's good. And then they start telling you what's really broken and miserable about this. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So one of the things, there's a methodology from Stanford University, their D school, called design thinking. So some of you may be familiar with this, some are not. But a big part of that is, I'm a design thinker, and a big part of that is asking why. So when you see the paperclip, it's not like, oh, that's cute. Well, why? What do you like about it? So to understand the why will help inform what to do with it. So design thinking and some of the methodologies of that might be interesting to some people.
Yep. And under what circumstances?
Interesting story about the paperclip. Do you know where the paperclip ended up? Well, he's living in Oahu with his life partner, Jar Jar Binks. Anyone? No? Okay.
Bill Gates got a standing ovation when he said it was going away. Yeah.
I'm Jill. I'm a grad student with the Integrated Design Management program here. And we're doing research right now for kids with special needs. And a lot of the stigma comes especially when they're in school. I guess in your experience, especially on the education side, is there any way for us, how can we make schools more neurodiverse? In the sense, are there any quick wins? Because not everybody can afford technology. Not just besides technology, we're looking at the systems. Are there certain products already being implemented that actually do create significant impact?
I was thinking of something similar to what I said earlier about the medical profession. You have to understand that every student is an individual and that they all have the capability to grow. You don't want to come in with these assumptions that just because a student has a disability that they have a problem, and that it's important to recognize that the standard curriculum may not necessarily be appropriate for the student in question because it might be too linear, it might not be linear enough. It might be too hard, it might be too easy, it might be too repetitive, it might not be repetitive enough. There are all these different variables that are important to take into account. Now, I know that there are standards to which you have to adhere, given that there's the Common Core and various state standardized tests, the SAT, there are all these standardized tests, high stakes testing that you have to take into account, but there are ways in which you can still differentiate instruction, especially for students who qualify for services under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So you just kind of have to build diversity and build inclusion from the ground up, as opposed to going, oh, here are the 80% of these students that match this central tendency. They're in the hump of the bell curve, and you've got these folks on the tails, and we're just gonna kind of staple on these accommodations afterwards. No, you have to build it in from the ground up and recognize that you're gonna have outliers. No matter what happens, there are always exceptions. And basically, you have to apply exception handling to education. There's gonna be exceptions. Now, I'm not saying that students with disabilities are errors, but you have to handle these situations as they come up, as opposed to saying, you know what, if you don't fit into this hump of the curve, you don't matter, or you are an inconvenience, or as a certain government official said, that students with disabilities were the single most irritating problem for teachers in the country. No, that's obviously not right.
So I would also add, I think you're also referring to the phenomenon in schools where children are discriminatory towards other children, right? And that plays out. I mean, and as a former Boston public school teacher, I taught students with special needs in Charlestown, and you recognize right away that they're hypersensitive to any kind of difference that they observe, and their response is usually negative. It's usually to shame the person or to make fun, look at this person there, and it could be the smallest thing. Like if I came to class with my hair down as opposed to being up in the bun, the class would erupt. I'm like, oh my God, what? Hey, Mrs. A, or they call me Mr. A because they couldn't pronounce my last name, but it was, it was something as subtle as that. I think so. One of the things we have to, so that told me as a teacher that one, it's obviously it's part cultural, but it's probably also natural, right, for us to notice differences in others, right? And maybe it comes from we have to determine very quickly whether or not this person is a threat, and so is it a friend or foe? I need to know right away, right? But I think what teachers have to do, and I think schools are the best places to do it, is to cultivate a truly inclusive environment, right? And there are models for what that looks like, and if you go to the Henderson School in Dorchester, you'll see full inclusion at its best. And the whole point of inclusion was so that students who were typical and atypical could see each other, learn from each other, normalize difference, and celebrate it and accept it and embrace it. But it's not enough just to have children of different types and learning styles in the same room. The teacher has to be very skilled at facilitating inclusion, celebrating. One of the things I was always intentional about doing is celebrating all kinds of examples of success, and making sure that everyone was celebrated for something that was unique about them. And so to combat the negative culture of shaming, but I think so. that we need to be more consistent about that across schools, but also culturally, because they learn it from somewhere. But I think teachers have to become more skilled and more assertive about cultivating a learning-oriented environment that is inclusive, that celebrates difference, and then grow from there.
Karthik, and then.
Yeah, I completely agree with what was just said. I have a colleague who studies the manifestation of chronic diseases after one crosses well into adulthood, like post 30, 40 years old. And some of the findings that are coming in right now is that when you are told that repeatedly that you're different and you basically have a very hard time in school, it turns out that the way that's physiologically processed by the body, the adverse impacts sometimes are not known until a very long time. And it somehow, the body just seems to keep a score of what happened. And some of the studies that are basically drawing parallels with soldiers who come back from wars with PTSD, and they begin to associate memories of very crazy things that happened with them when a bomb exploded or a colleague died, that is very triggering for them and sends their body into a tailspin. This researcher was saying over and over again, when she was tracking these people all the way back to their childhood, adverse events during childhood and repeated social adverse events in school is extremely damaging, and something that I think everybody should just take very seriously, because it tends to be very internalized and physiologically processed, I think.
Fully agree.
Did you have another on that, Ned? And then we'll go to, yeah, okay, go back to you.
Actually, I have just a comment related to the current question. Is that a lot depends on how an accommodation is offered. My son has sensory needs, and when he was told, like, well, you have a particular need, so we can bring in a bumpy cushion for your chair or a strap so you can bang your feet on it, it helped, but he hated it because he was the only kid in the room who had a different chair. And then the next year he went into a classroom where the teacher said, we have a lot of different chairs. Which one would you like? To all the kids. And he had such a better year. So just starting from the place that we're a community where people need different chairs.
Great example.
Yeah.
Great example. We were pointing out our class, filling out this matrix of neurodiverse characteristics, and so many people with no labels shared exactly the same. I bet a lot of kids loved having those other options, right? So let's offer those things to everybody. It's great. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ines. I'm a postdoc here at MIT, and my question goes to both Rafiq and Ned, I suppose. Earlier today, we had the MIT Intelligence Quest campaign starting, and Eric Schmidt was there. And he spoke about that the future of, I suppose, everything is in the intersection of AI and healthcare. Now, I suppose somehow you fit into that category, so congratulations on that. But he also mentioned that he feels that regulation is something that should come basically as late as possible. Therefore, my question to you would be, how and in which ways, really, do you cooperate with regulators in the specific industry that you're working with to ensure that the products you develop are actually for the benefit of the people who need them?
Thank you. Important question, an important time where the human brain is graduating. The human brain is now capable of making things that can have brain-like intelligence, and then can go back and help amplify, fix, augment the brains of the rest of us. It's an amazing time. It can be used for ill, it can be used for good. So there are regulators who make sure that something is medically safe. There are not regulators necessarily at another level, although there are policy people who will help us think about whether something is morally safe. And I think each is important. One good point of reassurance Many people worry about artificial intelligence taking us back over and giving us any of these movies that we've all created through time when there's a dystopian future. We've made those through time, and they were also Greek plays. We will be fine. We self-regulate. We will not probably create an intelligence that swallows us back up. But it's possible.
Singularity.
Probably not, I said. But regulators now, in the very, very clear sense, are extraordinarily important, partly because of some of the things we mentioned. These families are under tremendous stress. The members of the family who have the would-be label and the other members of the family. And there's a desperation index that you can plot, and it's extraordinary. Normally, a product will be of utility as measured by whether people will procure it, based on the certainty to which you believe that it will cause benefit and some kind of cost. And that curve could be linear. Curve for parents of say, autism, I know, is extraordinary. It's if there's even more than 0 chance that it might work, you're going to try it within whatever means you have. And that hump to the curve is the desperation index. And I think it's very important to regulate to make sure people don't take advantage of those families. And to not take advantage and to market correctly and to have backing and underpinnings to what you do is a large part of what, for instance, FDA does for regulation. It's not necessarily what we might think, a whole bunch of clinical studies, and it's just about what those, is it 0.99 or 0.999? It's also, do you have good manufacturing practices so each time you turn it out, it'll be identical? Do you report when people complain? And many other aspects. So regulation is very, very important. That being said, the philosophy of regulation can be self-policed by a community. And some regulations have slowed things down. So I think there's this tension between what the person said earlier, and I was at the event, and where I think digital medicine needs to go.
So how are you then cooperating or not cooperating with the regulators?
So we take on board good manufacturing practices that are the underpinnings of an FDA process. So cooperating with and taking the digital guidance. There was new digital guidance released as recently as my birthday, December 15th, so a few months ago, on what digital medicine can mean, and we're cooperating by virtue of following those guidelines. And so the whole world, the whole country, the regulatory bodies are learning what it means to create a product that can cause benefit, can be a therapeutic, and yet isn't a drug or a surgery or a laser or something like that. It's a behavioral process modulated by software. So this is that amazing time. The brain is circling back on itself, and our behavior, which we always have known as an indication of whether someone is on one side or another of that curve, now that behavior can be used as medicine to affect the change in the brain that's needed. So, do you want to also?
No, I couldn't have said it any better.
I think also sometimes there's a tendency to just make technology the villain, and certainly regulation is important, but it kind of makes me think about the Monopoly board game. The precursor to the Monopoly board game was actually the creator wanted to alert people about the ravages of capitalism and the dangers of greedy landlords. But the way it was popularized is the rules and everything were the same. Now it was your job to be the landlord. And just by changing the first principle goal, the whole dynamic of the game changed. And so sometimes when we think of regulation, it's not machine learning's fault. It's not a human being. For example, the use of any technology, say for a vulnerable population. The question is, why aren't we using some of the causal inference stuff that Roz works on right now to actually find out, instead of just predicting who's high risk, low risk, or medium risk, why don't we actually understand if you take away a driving license from somebody who's just been arrested and you expect them to come and have court hearings where failure to appear in court is another cross mark against your record, and that's what the algorithm is predicting. The causal root is something else, and technology can actually be very powerful in identifying those problems. Several times, I think the fundamental question becomes, what is it that we actually value? And so all the good things that can come from technology that can be prevented by increased regulation, I think the larger question is, what do we actually value? And can we actually get agreement there, is what I would say.
You're just making me think of an interesting case where, if you saw like a lot of kids with behavior problems in school, they found if they fixed their sleep, half the attention and behavior problems went away, right? So with a lot of the technology these days, you can see if a person's sleeping well or not. You might go back and say, maybe he wasn't just misbehaving behind the wheel of the car. Maybe he's sleeping bad, and maybe he's sleeping bad because he's in some housing with really bad noise and bad conditions. And if we fix some of that, maybe some of these other problems would drop dramatically. So technology can help us get to the causal factors too. Chrissy.
Hi. So we're talking about how we can design technology to help people with autism, but technology is not always the answer. And so I was wondering if you could touch on how technology or the use of it can also, in some sense, be like disabling or be a negative thing.
Challenging question.
It is.
Of course, there are, anything like technology, like any other tool that we use, can be used either for good or for ill. For example, if like some autistic folks may get so sucked into using, let's say, a computer as a communication tool, they get so sucked into it that it's harder for them to focus on other things, or they get distracted by games on their phone. There are plenty of different reasons why there may be some issue that causes technology to be detrimental, or the autistic person in question just may not like using technological methods to solve their problems. I mean, some folks just, like, regardless of age, just don't necessarily feel that that's the solution for them. So I do think that, I don't think that technology or anything else is an unalloyed good. There are detriments and positives.
We take this extremely seriously, and so thank you for the question. And it somewhat goes back to Inessa's question about regulatory, so regulation, and it's all about risk analysis. So what are the possible risks? So for instance, I have autism, I wear this, now everyone knows I have autism. So is that a risk? Comes back to identity and how challenging is that these days. But it's not just these days, it's these days. One school we're working with in Plymouth, another school in Lawrence. Lawrence is a very different community than Plymouth. If you don't know, probably the stigma could be greater in Lawrence. So what is the stigma value of wearing this? And then it comes to how it's messaged, which I think was said from this part of the room. So is this something like, hey, everyone, tomorrow, your friend and classmate is going to get something really cool. And I know you're all going to want to try it, but you can't until next week. And it's like, oh, it's the cool thing that's coming. He's getting this thing from Google versus, well, he kind of has these differences and we're going to help him, everyone be okay and be polite. So messaging really matters. But so we tested that. Will there be stigma? So we brought people in, the experts, children with autism who know what school is like and who know when things go catastrophically wrong in the social environment at school, and asked, try this, would you wear this, etc. So that's the paper we published. Data on their perceptions, their parents' perceptions, and later, another paper, we brought it to the school, asked the children with autism, as well as the classmates and the teacher and the para and the parent. How did it go? Was this better than you expected? What were the problems? What were the issues? And we capture that. And we just went to that school yesterday. Some of the teachers expressed, well, I don't know, would this out people? And could this be an issue? And by the way, what's the deal with Google Glass? This is actually the next version of Google Glass that people don't necessarily know came out. But isn't that passé? What's the deal? Okay, so we went, talked to one of the students who was actually a programmer doing some VR, and hey, have you tried Glass? No, I never have. Would you like to? Yes! And he like throws down the thing that he was doing, come on over and uses it. So we assess these risks. But there are very real risks around, I mean, simple possible risk, you know, you could fall or something like that, but also these very important ones about social risks of technology. You can't assume it's always going to be good, and it absolutely won't be. And that comes back to the iterative design unless you intentionally think about what are your riskiest assumptions and test them.
Yeah.
Always test.
To add to that, one aspect of brain power software, it essentially gamifies social interaction, and one tension that Ned and I have had is, as someone who grew up a gamer, I'm like, oh, like we should make your avatar like. They should let people choose, and you could grow as you get more skilled. They should get muscles, and you could change the outfits. And he was like, no. We don't want to make the game too good, where they don't, right? It's not actually about the game. It's not actually about the technology. It's about facilitating this human connection, right? This human interaction, right? I was like, wait, what? We don't want to make the game good.
To go back to those values.
But I think to the extent that I would have won that argument and made this great game, I think it would have ultimately made the software and technology less effective, because it would have been a deterrent to genuine social interaction, which is what we actually want to encourage and train. So,
At the mic.
Great. My colleagues say I'm like vertically challenged, so I have to angle this to my height. My name is Sati. I work at Boston Children's Museum. I do a lot of accessibility work and inclusion work in the museum. My question actually sort of half got answered by your comment about testing the product, so this might end up being more like a piggyback comment rather than question, but I just had a thought about social emotional aspects of the technology or accommodation in general. So I worked with this company that makes robots for kids with autism, and it has a lot of good functions, but how they sort of like pitch their product, one of the ways that they did it was that because it's like so cool and it's like, human, like a cute human like looking, that like if this kid has it, like other kids got interested in like what the child has, and then like it helps open up the conversation, because oftentimes these kids have some issues maybe with like a social interaction sometimes. And that's sort of how they presented us, like this is a cool thing that the child can have, and that helps other kids be more interested in this child, and then that can sort of help with the social interaction. And I hear sort of a similar comments or similar arguments about like some like service animals that sometimes kids with autism have, or companion animals. And again, that sort of like helps open up the conversation. So that's like a really, so it's, it can be presented as like a really positive thing, but how someone else, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but how she was explaining about the bumpy chairs, and how having something different can make you stand out in a wrong way is a sort of polar opposite side of the issue. Like, I just don't know, like, what exactly makes the difference of, like, I have this, like, something, like, really cool and special, and, like, people are interested in me because of this, versus I feel stigmatized because I have this special product. As you can see, I have visual impairment, and I think a lot of times what I hear, what I heard growing up, but I think I still hear it now, is that a lot of blind kids often, especially if they're mainstream, have struggle using assistive technology, not because they can't use it, but because they're afraid of standing out in a wrong way. Unfortunately, I think my personality helped to really totally not care about this, and that sort of like helped me like kind of like excel in school. But I was raised mainstream, so I did not go to like a specialized blind school or anything. But how the blind school teacher that I was getting some support from, how she was sort of telling me is that, again, like, I'm sort of like, again, how she was telling me that I was kind of like a success example, but it's really difficult for her to encourage other kids to use whatever the device that she was introducing, because again, like the other kids like don't necessarily want to stand out. And at that time, like I was like 10, and she was like asking me like why I feel okay using it. I was like, I don't know. But again, I think my question is, or comment is like, what's making a difference between something that can be like really cool because you have it versus like, I just feel really embarrassed because I'm using this, I'm standing out in the wrong way. Part of my thinking was that, especially again, this argument comes from like either like a robot type of product or animal, like something that like seems like a companion rather than a tool. I don't know, again, I don't have any answer to myself, but I don't know that if that's somehow helping more with the social emotional piece of how especially kids, you know, can use this technology. And I don't know if you, again, I think you can answer some of the questions by testing, but I don't know if you have other thoughts about, again, like when you make your product or design something, how that sort of can be a cool thing or can be more like a normalizing thing that everyone can use.
Thanks for your comment. Before we address that, I just want to be mindful of time because we're going to try to have everybody onto their next things by 8. So I'm going to ask you to not only respond to her comment, but make your closing statement of anything else you want to say as well. And then we'll adjourn, and then people can have informal additional Q&A if they want. So we'll,
I wanted to respond to her question, and I think for me, it relates to the question that the woman, I think Jill was her name, who asked about inclusion and addressing stigma in a traditional educational environment. And I do think that it is, it's about the culture, right? I think it's about what culture is being fostered in that particular environment. That ultimately dictate how our products or technology or this thing that could cause you to stand out will be perceived, right? I think when you, in a healthy, productive, learning-oriented environment that is inclusive and celebrates difference, you remove the threat of antagonism, of negative, attention, right? So why wouldn't you then want to have something that can support you and help you, right? I think only in environments that are harmful or where there's real cause for fear, right? Where there was a real threat of harm, mental harm, physical harm, or just ostracism, then does that sort of aversion arise? It's like, I don't want to stand out. It's not. I know I have this experience. It's uncomfortable. I want to avoid it. But it's about the environment. It's about the culture that is shared within that environment. And I think we've been fortunate so far to introduce our products in environments that are supportive and celebrate difference and things like that. But I would say it has less to do with the product itself and more the environment.
I think that I agree that it's absolutely important to avoid stigma when introducing accommodations or technology or other assistive tools that help students with disabilities. And that can be accomplished in a number of ways. For example, several people actually mentioned like introducing it as a cool thing, as something interesting that other students can enjoy, or offering the same tool or technology to other students to sort of diffuse the stigma. A third option, however, is to present this thing as to destigmatize disability itself. People often treat disability as though it were a bad word that should be avoided. I don't think it should be avoided. We as humans exist with different abilities and different disabilities. And I think that it is absolutely important not to shy away from recognizing that disability is something that affects people. And it can affect, and it's one of the few one of the few disadvantaged or marginalized groups that anybody can join at any time. Anybody can get in an accident. You know, anybody can, you know, have a brain injury, get dementia, get Alzheimer's, get some sort of condition that affects the brain, affects cognition, affects intelligence. So it's important to not only practice universal design, but work on the structural factors that create stigma around disability in the first place, so that if there's like a reason why a given student is the only one that uses that tool, that student isn't stigmatized, that they aren't made to stand out just for being who they are and having a disability. You have to be honest. You have to recognize that it is not something that you can avoid. It's not something that can be sort of euphemized and pushed away. Disability is not a bad word, and neurodiversity is the default state of the human condition. We are all different, and that isn't a bad thing. We need to incorporate that into our very lives and within our philosophies of how to create technology that assists people with disabilities. Disability, again, is not a bad word.
I think to conclude, I'll basically just recap my own experience, which is it's been very empowering for me. When I first took Roz's class, it had all these readings as assignments, and you had to write answers to some questions that were posed after you read them. And usually I think my assignments, I turned in like 20 or 21 pages for every question. The other instructor actually stopped me saying, "Can you please stop doing that, because I actually have to wake up early just to grade your assignment." And usually riddled with grammatical errors and all kinds of stuff, but I still remember when I got the feedback from Roz, she used to correct all the grammatical mistakes in my assignment, and it was just filled with very thoughtful responses, as well as, "Oh my God, this is such a cool insight." And I never actually seen a professor who was that welcoming of insights from a student. And finally, when I got the diagnosis and I went to Roz, she said something like, "Of course you're on the spectrum. How else do you think you got into MIT?" And I think she kind of supplemented that by saying, "Not to worry, it's more of a requirement if you are a faculty member." And so ever since that happened, I kind of learned to just enjoy myself without being too judgmental. It was a gradual process. And we have these events at the Media Lab called Members Week, where a lot of human beings just come to this place for 2 whole days. And after one of the meetings, I was just telling Roz, it's just been too many human beings the last couple of days. I just want to be by myself. And she said, "Well, I'm very similar." And so we kind of were high-fiving, and nobody else could understand like why we were doing that, which was cool. And also in cases where I've had to go and make a presentation or speak with people, she's also importantly pushed me out of my own comfort zone a little bit, because sometimes I feel like in order to function, just as it's important to celebrate neurodiversity, you have to stretch yourself just a little bit, just out of your comfort zone, and that's happened many times. And I just think that kind of an environment can be very, very powerful, more than any single technology or design. That environment was very impactful for me, and I would say that I wish that every person who feels that he or she is neurotypically divergent, if any such thing exists, deserves to be in that kind of an environment.
Thanks. Ned?
Right. Thanks. Well, first I want to address the last question and then do tiny summary. So last question, I didn't encode your name. Yes. Say it? Saki. Saki. Well, thank you. And so you posed the question, I believe, what can help someone with a need adopt the technology that can help serve that need, and not want to reject it and what it could label the person as. And I don't have a perfect answer, but I believe in micro successes. So micro successes built into everything we do, very, very small and achievable goals that keep giving the feedback of you've achieved. And that can have a spreading capability, a spreading effect on confidence. And it strikes me that you particularly are someone who's very confident. And since you were describing something that happened to you at age 10, you know, that came early for you, and that's fabulous. And that's been a coping strategy and a protective layer around you. Some people begin with very little confidence and have the lack of confidence reinforced. So how do we enforce an increase in confidence? And one answer is this micro successes idea. It's not the only. Another thing to remember is that a child's brain is still learning. It's still forming. And that comes on both sides. So you can introduce that forming brain to something in a new way. You can color it. You can say, this is cool. And you can trick someone into believing something is cool, and it becomes cool. Likewise, who are those other kids in the class? Who are the bullies? They're just kids struggling to find their identity. And you find your identity by defining it against someone else sometimes, or finding this little part in which you're safe. You can carve that out by decrying what others have that makes them different. Because deep down inside, you know that you're different. And so, but we can teach them. And I was there in a classroom where the mother of one of the kids that we have worked with gave a lesson to the class. She's a special needs teacher. And she asked everyone, so who here goes to bed with the lights still on? Who goes to bed with the lights off? Who brushes your teeth like this? Who brushes your teeth like that? Who likes sweet things? Who likes cold things? And everyone was just all over the map. It was that randomly distributed matrix that you were showing me earlier. And she's like, okay, so you're all different. And why don't you guys who are lights on go over there and lights off go over there? And you know, can you find ways that you can make fun of each other? Of course you can. You all are different. And you know, it's so simple and trite, but it's not. This is a learning brain who's saying, oh, wow, I have something about me that's a little peculiar, particular, idiosyncratic, beautiful, something I can embrace, that's me, that's identity. These are all flip sides of the same thing. And she rendered that beautiful lesson out there and then was like, okay, who here has something that has a name and a label? Okay, there's that. Well, you know, how different is that kind of difference than the differences that you already realize that you have? And I thought that was a beautiful lesson and a simple way of addressing kind of your question from earlier, how to introduce it. Just one of thousands of possible ways, but to train the learning brain. And so I'd say, if anything, in wrapping up, let's hew closely to the brain. It's this amazing, possibly most complicated little wiggly piece of matter in the universe, although we're biased, and try to understand it, us, and bring solutions that actually have some basis in the brain. And let's do science. So science is testing hypotheses. So that comes down to a hypothesis, riskiest assumption of the person I'm trying to serve will actually benefit from this, will adopt it, will like it. That's science, that's testing, that's being humble. And you know, we have the privilege here of being under the tutelage of Professor Picard, all of us, who has carefully, methodically done science for decades when there was no such thing as affective computing, affective science, and has created this field, not because necessarily just of good words or good ideas, but of good science. And I think we all need to remember that humbling lesson of testing our assumptions and building confidence in ourselves and what we're doing and in each other.
All right, I wasn't expecting all these nice comments, but I just would like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists who I have had a fabulous time learning from. Thank you.